This is episode 9 of the Casting Shadows podcast. And as befits that number, today we are going to talk a little bit about corruption. The last 2 episodes have been about fear in one way or another. Fear and games that include mechanisms to help shape the experience of fear during roleplay, or to define it, or to put limitations on player decisions for their characters, however you come at the game. And in the previous episode, we looked at a philosophical framework, a rationale for how to include this type of roleplay in games where those mechanisms do not exist, where we can remind ourselves in a way what defines character. And so this isn't so much a tangent into the topic of corruption as it is an expansion on those previous episodes. The Casting Shadows podcast is itself an extension of the Casting Shadows blog, which was started simply to share experiences of roleplay for gamers that started in the 80s or before. There were pools, there were cultures of play that grew up that could be as small as just one group in one short period of time, or could be a little bit more regional, spread and cultivated by whatever convention experience existed or whatever interaction was possible through the growth of friendly local game stores. Now, of course, we're all intimately connected to whatever degree we wish through our various social media outlets. But as we go back toward the 70s and the ostensible birth of our hobby, there are many things which newcomers may not realize are old ideas. There are many avenues of play. There are many dead ends. There are many rebirths. There are many twists and turns. There are many different ways to come at the hobby, not all of which have made it into the mainstream, or not all of which are easy to access. And if we, those people who grew up in those small cultures of play, don't share them, the risk of loss is quite high. And that is something to be avoided. So, the Casting Shadows blog was begun to share my small part of those experiences. It has a further extension into YouTube. You can find it at youtube.com/runeslinger, my nom de plume for the internet. Okay. If you're the type of person who uses Facebook, and if you're the type of person who uses Twitter, you can also find me on those places under the same moniker. Twitter.com/runeslinger, Facebook.com/runeslinger. All of those social media outlets are serving this same general goal, to encourage people to talk about how they used to play, how they're playing now, how they would like to be able to play, and bridging the gap between where we are and where we hope to be. On November 4th of 2010, early in the life of the written blog, I wrote a post called Corruption, the Other White Meat. And it began an exploration of a series of posts that look at how we view character. There are different ways to bring character into our role play, positive and negative, as with everything else. There are different ways to express what we are doing with character, and that would also follow on from the thoughts raised by this post. There are perspectives and points of view. There are ways to read your fellow players at the table based on the language that they're using in moments of stress and excitement that give you insight into how they are experiencing the game. How many filters, through how many layers are they experiencing the game? Which are ones that they are putting up intentionally as a framework for what they see as good play? Which ones are instinctive, automatic? Which ones are accidental? It's kind of interesting. And the lens by which this began through this post of sharing this idea is corruption, the other white meat. So, in the last two episodes, we were looking at fear. And fear in role-playing games, as we mentioned earlier, tends to be tied to sanity. Not so much the experience of an emotion, but the damaging effects of experiencing emotion in order to turn a character's ability to endure amounts of fear into a resource to be managed. So we can play this as far away from personal experience as we like. We can simply be looking down at the character sheet and watching the numbers spin away and trying to do things that might allow us to recoup some of the loss. Or we can play this very, very close to our own conception of who we are. And we can feel the sting of even the potential loss of just a few points of this resource, of this mental resilience resource, whatever the game you're playing calls it. We can view even the smallest loss as something to actually fear. Well, what about that exposure? What about those effects? Some games will limit play to simply focusing on the notion of mental health, of sanity, and they will do things like applying flaws or applying psychological conditions or phobias onto the character in order to constrain behavior and show the marks of the stress fractures in that resource of mental stability. Other games handle it differently. So in Call of Cthulhu, we are very used to sanity being portrayed as a number, and it has more potential of decreasing than increasing. But if the investigators are successful and are aware that they have had some form of success, then they, with a certain amount of luck, may slow that tide of impending insanity to a very respectable career as an investigator of cosmic horror. But in Leagues of Cthulhu by Triple Ace Games using Ubiquity, another layer has been added in, and that is this express notion of corruption. It was very interesting to me when the manuscript first came across my desk to edit to see it right there. Corruption. It's like, oh, someone else has had these, or had their thoughts follow this same sort of path. What are effects other than the application of fears, of phobias, and of mental conditions? So the way it's expressed in Ubiquity then, in Leagues of Gothic Horror, in Leagues of Cthulhu, is corruption. And what corruption does, what corruption brings about, are flaws. And these are flaws that arise from the character's behavior in play. It's the mark of villainy. It is the surest sign that the character has crossed the line between what is, let's say, right and good and just for them to be doing and what is not. It's opposite, right? We can use terms like good and evil. We can even use them in all caps if we want for Leagues of Gothic Horror. We can say that if the character, for whatever reason, for whatever motivation, has been pushed into doing evil acts, then they will be experiencing, they are experiencing the corruption of their essence. And this will leave stains. And so we are able to handle the impacts of great fear by diminishing a mental resilience resource, their sanity. And we can model the effect on the person as a member of society through their exposure to, or to their actually being corrupted. This is very interesting. Now, both of these examples, Call of Cthulhu and Leagues of Gothic Horror or Leagues of Cthulhu, these mechanize the process of this decline or of this effect. We can see it on the character sheet. We can talk about it in terms of numbers, and we have a conversation about the ongoing effects. What should the effect be, for example? How can I get rid of the effect? Is it possible to, remove this stain from my character's soul? This kind of thing. We can talk about it in very mechanical terms, and we can talk about it completely out of character. We can talk about it out of game. We can sit down and have a coffee somewhere and talk about our campaign and talk about the numbers. Not all games have this sort of structure. This is something to remember. We talked in the last episode about All for One and how fear isn't portrayed as a mechanism in the game. The characters are going to be able to stand up against the horrors. They're not going to crack and break like we might expect an investigator in a Call of Cthulhu game to, or like we might expect an investigator, a globetrotter, in Leagues of Cthulhu. We can reasonably expect them at a certain point to break under the mental pressure. This will not happen to your musketeer in All for One. This will not happen in a game of Palladium Fantasy. We won't expect this to happen in Ars Magica, for example. These games don't provide us with those mechanisms. But our roleplay, our sense of the character, can. And this is where corruption, the other white meat, found its topic. In this article, what came up was that often the resistance to these kinds of, let's say, character developments was not the lack of any mechanism for it provided in the game, but was instead an outright resistance by the player. They did not want their character to change in that way, regardless of how consistent it might be, how appropriate it might be, how every indicator about the developing fiction of play, every indicator back from the mechanisms that did exist, right? Every die roll, the reactions of their fellow players, they would just draw the line and say, no. And we can see this in more than just things related to fear. Whether a character will fall in love, whether a character will break a promise, whether a character will switch religions, change sides. And so this article, Corruption, the Other White Meat, went through some of these examples, how even when having one of those coffees, talking about the games and its numbers and its influences, sitting down with players and saying, what did you think about the speech made by, let's say, the villain, right? So we could use in games of Vampire, when Sabbat infiltrators break into Camarilla coteries and they begin talking about their view of how things should be. And it seems like the characters are buying in. And so as the storyteller, as the game master, you sit down and talk with the players afterward, and we're sitting around having our coffees and talking about the game in the middle of the night. And it's like, how did this Sabbat character's pitch seem to you about their philosophy on life? And they're like, yeah, that makes a whole lot more sense than what the elders in this city are spouting as Camarilla doctrine. And then you drop the big bomb and say, so why didn't you convert? And the reason why they didn't had nothing to do with their character, had nothing to do with the persuasiveness of the NPC involved, had nothing to do with the setting, had nothing to do with anything except the player's notion that the Sabbat were the bad guys, or that this would be a fall, or that falling to this path would be surrendering, giving up on their humanity resource, and therefore, in a sense, losing something, being a failure. There were many different answers that night about why they didn't want to do this. But none of them had anything to do with the fiction of play. And I would have this experience play out again and again and again with different groups in different places. I would also, of course, which is why I stuck with games like this, I would also have the opposite experience. But there too, that could be tempered by people rushing into it. People deciding, I really want my character to fall, or I really want my character to be corrupted, or I really want my character to fall in love. And so without any rationale in the game for it to happen, would proceed to make it so, and leave the rest of the playgroup wondering where this was coming from. And so this article looked at this phenomenon from both sides, as the game master and as the player, as someone who has seen success and as someone who has seen failure. So finding the corruption mechanic in Leagues of Gothic Horror was very satisfying. To see a new way of bringing this question into play, with it being less of a question of managing a resource and more of a question of managing behavior. And it put me in mind of Pendragon, in much the same way that exposure to early World of Darkness games with their virtues would put me in mind of Pendragon. Pendragon seems to have broken ground on the idea of putting some mechanical, not so much reinforcement, but mechanical recognition of character perspectives. So that sitting there, listening to your fellow players, listening to the game master, who's also a fellow player, and putting yourself in the scene as your knight, and being aware of all the emotional forces pushing and pulling on them, all the cultural forces pushing and pulling on them, of the code of how they are expected to behave by society, the ideal to which they're trying to live up. All of these things are visible in front of the player on a simple sliding scale, a spectrum, if you will, from this to that. And we are somewhere in between. And the dice are telling me that the character is pulling toward virtue or is pulling toward vice. And I, as the character, can go with it, can embrace that experience of what the system is communicating to me about the character as a collaborator about the character. Or I can choose to resist. And if I choose to resist, I have to recognize that the experience was real. And therefore, I need to accept a system consequence that's going to occur down the line by resisting what the dice have indicated about the character's emotion or about the character's urges. This is pretty fascinating. This is something that's largely absent in Old World of Darkness play, but you can see its genesis here in Pendragon. And so when I come across corruption in Leagues of Gothic Horror, I am strongly reminded of Pendragon. Of course you can do this thing. Of course you can violate what any right-thinking member of the Victorian society in which the game is set would think of as right and good and true. And maybe that will have consequences socially, and maybe it won't. But when you come to the point of committing acts of evil, then there's a price to pay. And that price, you may not notice it the first time, or the second time, or the third time. But if that behavior persists, the character will be changed. The character will be marked in a way that is obvious to other members of their society. And then it will be that little bit harder to act on the side of good. The character will have been corrupted. The resistance to this kind of play, the resistance to emotion in play, falling in love, breaking a promise, changing sides, whatever it is, the resistance to it tied to player ego or tied to meta concerns of what's the right thing to do from a player standpoint for achieving a win condition or alignment with a particular type of character, and we're going to force this character to comply with that vision of this ideal character that you want to represent, or the character is an idealized representation of the self that you're bringing to life in play every single time you play. And so therefore it cannot be changed by exterior forces that do not match what it is that you're trying to portray. This resistance is out there. The resistance is out there. Resistance to the resistance. Is it futile? Well, I guess it depends ultimately on what sort of play you are willing to experiment with if you haven't put yourself into the shoes of the character in the moment. And it's practically essential for this to be, in a sense, genuine, in a sense, to be felt by the other people with whom you are playing, that it is in the moment. It's not something that you want to end the session on and take away and think about over the weekend and consider carefully as an author might their character, but instead it's something that tells you its truth in the moment. This character has been affected. I have been affected by this moment, but not I, the player. I, the character who exists because of the player. It's a fine line. We can tell when it rings false. We can tell when character changes are made for the sake of change. And we can tell when character changes are resisted, let's say, for the sake of resistance. And we can tell when character change is right. So, what are your experiences with the idea of corruption? Take that as far as you like, whether this is simply change. The character has grown and changed in some way. They've let go of something that was important, or they have begun to cling more tightly to something which was less important. They've found a goal, or they've abandoned a goal. They have found a moral standpoint, or they have abandoned one. They have changed sides. They have fallen in love. They've fallen out of love. They have committed an act they swore they never would. They have been changed because of their experiences. Let me know. If you follow the podcast on Anchor, you can respond to this via recording a voice message, or you can contact me through the other social media methods, which are provided on all of my social media outlets. Anyway, thanks for listening to episode 9. If you're interested, you can see the genesis of trying to share this idea in Corruption, the Other White Meat, which was written on November 4th of 2010 on castingshadowsblog.com. It's never too late to add a new segment, I guess, to an old podcast episode. Yesterday, I got a surprise voice message. The first one since I launched the podcast, and that's great. Steve Swan, who is a regular commenter over on YouTube on a variety of my videos and videos that others in my circle of game masters and players and whatnot make, left a pretty interesting description, which I'm going to play for you, so you'll be able to assess it yourself. But if not corruption, then definitely he set himself up to roleplay with the cooperation of his game master through the idea of temptation. And that's pretty interesting. And one part of his description struck me as very interesting. In this podcast, we were talking in very general terms with some specific examples, but generally we were general. However, in his 1-minute voice message, you can hear something very specific, a very specific kind of play. So take a listen and let's see if you hear what I hear.
Anthony, you'd mentioned about corruption. And recently I ran a warlock in a 5e game, and I ran him very fun and jovial. And he was fun to play. He just couldn't be held down, and he was willing to talk to anybody incessantly in a high-pitched, fast voice. And then when I hit the middle levels, 5 and 6, I turned him darker, and he took dark spells instead of the fun spells that he had before. And then as I got to 7, 8, 9, 10th level, I brought him back out slowly. There wasn't really a mechanical disadvantage or a mechanical system for the corruption. It was more just my role playing and enjoying it. I'm not even sure the other players knew, but the DM and I did, and I had a great time playing that character.
Okay, we're back. Now, I won't keep you in suspense, of course. The thing that really caught my ear was that the awareness or broadcasting of these intentions to the other players was not required. It wasn't required for it to be fun, and it wasn't required for it to be a satisfying experience for the player. This is a style of play where not everything that flits through the transom of your character's mind needs to be expressed. There are some things which can be appreciated just as much if the other players have the option to notice what you're doing, have the option to figure things out, or can remain oblivious, that secrets can be allowed. All right? I think this is fascinating. There are styles of play now where we are expected to describe everything, both the internal lives of our characters and their appearances and what's going on around them. And depending on the game, the distance, the area of effect around our character over which we have the expectation or the responsibility to describe can be quite large compared to some other games where there's no expectation at all that you will explain anything. And if someone is at the table describing and another person is at the table not describing, and one person is trying to follow an understanding of a character different from themselves, and the other person is just making decisions about a token, then these things can live in harmony, right? So we have a spectrum, believe it or not, that goes from not caring about the inner life of the character, not caring about sharing things that in real life we would have to exert some effort to glean, to an expectation of sharing them as part of the enjoyment and as part of the activity, as if the players and the people involved were experiencing fiction in a novel form or something along those lines. So I think this is really interesting to get this example out of the blue. Thanks a lot, Steve, for taking the time to do that, and I hope others will follow your excellent example. You've been listening to episode 9 of the Casting Shadows podcast. This episode was entitled Corruption and You. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, please consider contacting the blog and sharing your thoughts about your play with the specific games that you are playing, whether they include mechanisms for fear or corruption or morality or emotion or not. Okay. Casting Shadows in its various forms can be found at the following locations. In written form, castingshadowsblog.com. In video form, youtube.com/runeslinger. Twitter and Facebook /runeslinger. Okay. Until the next time, I hope you have great games, and that, as always, you will take care.